But fundamentally, the idea was very much the same, that there are structures, that the bottommost layer of structure in the world has to be the sense data, as Russell called them, that we have when we have empirical experience, out of which we build the physical objects that we encounter in the world. The physical objects are actually constructions out of actual and possible sense experiences that we have, and they are the atoms. Remember, in the Tractatus, the atoms of the world were objects, undefined. Wittgenstein said, I don't know what they are, but they must be there. But Russell actually gave us a candidate for the basic atoms of the world, and they are the sense data that we have. This is in line with the empiricist tradition of thinking about how we have our knowledge of the external world. But of course, the great difficulty there is that Russell had made an assumption common to all epistemologists since Descartes. Now, you were all reading the Meditations last night in the bath as well, so you remember Descartes starting from the contents of his own consciousness. I know what I am, I'm a thinking thing, and I have ideas and beliefs and so on. So from this internal perspective, I have to somehow or other rebuild a degree of certainty about what exists independently of me or outside my mind. And this is the project undertaken in Descartes' Meditations. And so the Cartesian starting point is the internal contents of one's states of consciousness. And that, of course, is precisely what Russell is doing in the Lectures on Logical Atomism, starting from the little bits in the computer sense of sensing that goes on in the inner space of our consciousness, from which we have to infer an external world or rebuild confidence in these internal states being genuinely representative of something outside ourselves. And this Wittgenstein recognized as posing a major problem. If you were starting as a kind of Robinson Crusoe figure, just all on your own, solo, to talk about the inner states of your own consciousness, how could you do it? How could there be a language which was logically private to yourself in which you could discuss these things so that you could attempt to rebuild your knowledge of the external world? Because isn't it the case that a language has to be public in order for it to exist at all? Here's an example of this. Supposing you are washed up on a desert island as a little baby before you've had any chance to be exposed to language. And somehow or other you grow up there safely, and one day a coconut falls on your head, it gives you a headache, and you say to yourself, I'm going to call this headache. And then, alas, 6 months later, another coconut falls on your head, and once again you've got a headache, and you say to yourself, now what did I call this the first time? Oh yes, headache. Now how would you know that you'd use that sound to denote the experience that you're having on the later occasion? Well, by memory, of course, because on the second occasion you're remembering the baptismal occasion. But here's the problem. Doing that is very like looking at something in The Guardian and thinking, good God, can that be true? And you rush out to buy another copy of The Guardian to see whether what the first one says is true. So really, you would, as a solo language user, never be in a position to know whether you are using terms with the same content, the same meaning as on an earlier occasion, unless you were a member of a linguistic community which could check and control your uses of expressions. Unless you were a member of a rule-following community of speakers who together constitute the meanings of the expressions they use and govern their respective uses of those expressions. So this is the important point that Wittgenstein raised about the impossibility that there could be a logically private language. Of course, there could be a contingently private one, like Pepys's diary and so on, but the point about those is that they can be translated into a public language, and so they're not logically private. But if there cannot be a logically private language, then there cannot be a Cartesian starting point for the theory of knowledge. That was the big contribution that Wittgenstein made in reacting to Russell's view. And you can see the connection between the rule-following considerations and the private language argument. They are, in a way, the reverse and obverse of the same point, because the reason why a language cannot be logically private is that language is a rule-governed activity, and rules can only exist in a public setting, can only be followed, can only be recognized as genuinely normative in a public setting. So those are things, two points that came out of Wittgenstein's view of language games and the self-constituting semantics of language on the basis of the language games idea, which gave rise to this, I think, permanent contribution to philosophy in the way of the private language argument and the rule-following considerations. So I suppose we have something to thank resentment for.